So, ever since I started teaching the history of the black man, ever since I started teaching the great civilization of our African ancestors, I see a lot of people come on that comment section to criticize me, to condemn me, to attack me. And you know the most interesting aspect of this? These people are all Africans. Many of them don't believe that their African ancestors were great, because the first history books that was written about the history of Africa was not written by Africans, but by the slave masters and colonizers. We mostly ask, why is Africa no longer great as it was in the past? Before looking into this question, it is very vital I bring to our notice that we are always vituperated and criticized by our own African brothers and sisters who mock us, ridicule us, and make caricature of us whenever we teach about the past civilization and greatness of our African ancestors. These Africans believe nothing good ever came out from Africa, and they strongly believe that nothing good will ever come out. The fall of Africa took a long historical process. To begin, we should understand that there are two types of Africans, and I need you to take note of these two types of Africans, because I am going to start with the first Africans. The Africans before slave trade and the ones after slave trade. Now, the Africans before slave trade were the first in the world to start the science of engineering, medicine, and astronomy. 10,000 years before the continent of Europe was known in history, around 833 BCE. Why did I say so? I said so because a people are known by the period they started writing. And the first person to write a book in Europe was named Homer in 833 BCE. He wrote two books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the year 833 BCE. From these two books, we knew that a people known as the Europeans existed. Now, these first Africans started the Nok civilization in West Africa, where huge sculptures were made from terracotta. The Dogon people in Mali started calculating the movement of the stars, the moon, and the planets, which shows Africans in the science of astronomy. They also started the science of medicine, and the first medical doctor or physician in the world was an African man named Imhotep, who cured over 200 diseases, including tuberculosis and arthritis. In fact, Imhotep was the father of medicine before Hippocrates was born. Africans were into the science of surgery. This is shown in the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus, showing Africans in Egypt and in Uganda carrying out a systematic process of surgery. The first cesarean section, which is CS, was done by Africans in Uganda over 2,500 years before the story of Adam and Eve. I know that you are going to argue. I know many of you are religious. You will say, what is Ebenezer Heru saying? That the first people in the world to carry out a successful cesarean section were the Africans in Uganda over 2,500 years before the story of Adam and Eve. What is Ebenezer Heru saying? That is what will be going on in the mind of many Africans who are deeply religious, because they don't know these things about their ancestors. Now, today, after our great civilization, we have become underdeveloped, backward, and poor. You see, the fact is that the fall of Africa took a long historical process. The collapse of Africa started when the black race was invaded. That is, the collapse of African civilization started when Africans were invaded by the invaders. The first invaders who came to Africa to invade our African ancestors were the Hyksos from Asia. They came to Africa, precisely North Africa, precisely Egypt, around 1675 BCE. This is 1675 BCE. They ruled the African Egyptians for 108 years after plundering, after exploiting the civilization of the African Egyptians. Now, before I go further, a lot of people do ask another very important question. They say, Ebenezer Heru, why do you always talk about Egypt? Let me tell you, if you want to understand the history of Europe, you have to look at the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Therefore, if you want to understand the history of Africa, you have to look at Kemet, which is the ancient name for Egypt, which means the land of the blacks. You have to look at Sudan and Ethiopia. According to the great professor Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, he said that for us to write the history of Africa correctly, then we have to link it to Egypt. That until we link the history of Africa to Egypt, then he doesn't think that we are going to write the history of Africa correctly. And it's true. Just as if you want to write the history of Europe correctly, you have to link it to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Let's go further. After the Hyksos invaded in 1675 BCE, they ruled for 108 years. They were the first outsiders who invaded our African ancestors. The Greeks from Europe invaded in 332 BCE under Alexander the Great, and they ruled for 300 years. The Romans were the second Europeans who invaded in 30 BCE and ruled for 600 years. And in the year 639 AD, the Arabs entered Egypt, invaded in 640, and conquered Egypt and the entire North Africa in 641 AD. The various invasion of the black race by foreign invaders marked the starting point for the collapse of the African civilization. The invaders plundered, distorted, and plagiarized the knowledge and history of the African people. You see, the second stage of the fall of Africa was the period of imperialism. Calm down. Imperialism is the economic and political control of the resources of poor and backward countries by a developed country. This period started with slave trade, where the able-bodied African young men and women were exploited as slaves. The result of this is that it presented to the world a degrading image of Africans, which we are suffering today under racism. Africans were humiliated and used as slaves to build the plantations and industries in America and Europe. Now, the other stages of imperialism were colonialism and neocolonialism, where African leaders are used by their former colonial masters to exploit and underdevelop Africa. What about the economy of Africa? To understand how the African economy became poor and backward, one must look into the crisis of capitalism in Europe. Now, the capitalist system in Europe was a system that encourages exploitation and inequality and the ownership of private property, which is capital. And capital was the cause of class struggle in Europe. In Europe, those who own no property had only their labor power. The European peasants, who are the propertyless class, who were paid little only for food in order to come back and work, were the working class. The owners of private property were called the bourgeoisies, a wealthy class who controlled the means of production. In the year 1848, in his Communist Manifesto, the German thinker Karl Marx penned down a prophecy of an inevitable violent socio-political revolution that will bring down the capitalist system of exploitation in Europe. Karl Marx said, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. What this means is that a violent socio-political revolution was boiling in Europe. The proletariats, that is the propertyless class, the peasants, the working class, the laborers, were so exploited by the bourgeoisies to the point where they see their production capabilities as different from themselves. They hated what they produced. To avert the boiling revolution, European politicians and capitalists, through colonialism, exploited the African economy in order to improve the working conditions of the proletariat in Europe. The thing is that African resources were cheaply bought and sometimes forcefully taken from Africans and sold back in an exorbitant price. The outcome of this was that Africans became primary producers, while the Europeans became secondary producers. We still cannot refine our natural resources. Rather, we appreciate imported finished products. Africa is in dilemma, and this dilemma is called dependency. Now, what is dependency? Dependency is the process whereby the economy of Africa is tied to the growth and development of the European economy. France, Britain, Italy, Germany, Russia will always exploit the resources in Africa. If not, the European economy will collapse. The more Africa is underdeveloped, poor and backward, the more the European economy develops. You see, during colonialism, the African economy was integrated into the international capitalist system, where the Europeans introduced their own European currencies by destroying African local currencies. Our African workers were frustrated to the point whereby they have no choice but to pick up European jobs in order to get the new currency. The result of this was that the European currencies tied African economy to their European economy. They built roads and established infrastructures during colonialism in Africa, not really to develop Africa, but to facilitate the exploitation of our natural resources. For instance, all the roads and railways built in the northern, western, and eastern part of Nigeria were built to exploit the groundnut in the north, the cocoa in the west, and the palm oil in the east. Their missionary churches worked closely with the European colonialists to keep Africans mentally exploited with the application of biblical verses. The missionaries preached to Africans to love and cherish poverty. Africans are made to believe that it is very hard for a rich man to make heaven. This was what King Leopold II of Belgium told the missionaries in Congo to preach to the Africans in Congo, that they should cherish and love poverty, that it is very hard for a rich man to make heaven. This is a way that they kept Africans mentally poor and mentally backward. Africans are still suffering from mental and religious colonization. It is time for us to break free from this slavery and embrace knowledge. The only solution to this mental colonization is knowledge of ourselves. That is why there are some books, there are some documents and materials that will open the eyes of the black man and the black woman to understand their true history. Now, these books I want to outline are all in soft copy PDF. If you're interested to buy, my inbox is open. Send a message to my inbox or DM me requesting that you want to buy your own copy of the books. We have the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Papyrus of Ani, the destruction of black civilization, the untold history of the black race and the fall of African civilization, the books of Enoch, and many more that will open your eyes to understand the untold history of your African ancestors.